Okay, well, in the old days, when it was O-levels, most people did a maximum of 9, which is what I did. I went to a girls' grammar school, and I had to do maths, even though I hated it. I did 1 language, and all my other subjects were arts. I didn't do any sciences for O-level at all. Then when it came to A-level, I did English, history and French. Well, the subject that I always loved most and was always best at was English. So obviously I did English language and English literature, then I did English literature for A-level. And when I was at Teacher Training College, where I did my Bachelor of Education, my main subject was in English. So yes, that's always been my passion, and I do believe that if you want to be a good writer, you have to be a big reader. I've read all my life. I grew up with unconventional parents, which set me apart, I always felt, from the other girls, because we didn't have a car. My parents were pacifists with sort of Quaker ideals. They were not materialistic in any way. They were quite strict with me, and I always had to be home earlier than the other girls. However, now, although I was rather resentful at the time, I look back on it and see that I was loved and protected, and I've very much adhered to the ideals that my parents brought me up with. I was a teacher. I had wanted to be a teacher from the age of about 5. I used to arrange all my dolls and teddies and trolls and whatnots in rows as if they were an assembly, and I used to make them all little notebooks and do different handwriting for all of them, and then I used to mark their works, all very sad. But I was clearly destined to be a teacher, and my mum was a primary school teacher before me. But I always wanted to be a writer as well. So I consider myself very lucky because I got to do both things. I was a teacher for about 19 years, on and off, before I got published as an author. So I was always writing, and then one summer holiday I decided I was approaching a big birthday, and if I didn't try to write something with a view to being published, then I knew I was going to look back later on in my life and wonder why I hadn't tried harder. So I wrote a story drawing on my experiences of alopecia. So it's not autobiographical, it's adapted from life. But I created a character with alopecia, and writing that book changed my life because, it began to change the way I saw my alopecia. I began to feel a bit braver because my character was dealing with alopecia better than I was. And when that struck me, I thought, hang on, what's going on? But when Michael Morpurgo read it, just as a manuscript, and rang up to tell me that it was beautifully written, of course, that was when I believed that I could become an author.
So what was that book?
It's called The Waterhouse Girl. It wasn't the first one to be published, but it was the first one I wrote, and a few years later I went back to it and broadened it and deepened it so that it's not just a narrow and quite emotional story of a girl who loses her hair. There's a subplot, there's more humour, it's a bigger story.
What would you say the best thing about being an author is?
I think knowing that something that I've written, something I've felt quite passionate and emotional about, has meant something to somebody else. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter whether a book of mine has been important to 1 million people or 10. That's still a big deal. So every single email I get, or occasionally letter in the post from a fan saying, I've just read this book and I really loved it and I really liked the way this and it made me feel that. That's a big high every single time. When I was a teacher, I used to love story time more than any other time of day. And of course, if you're doing story time, you need a story that will really hold the audience. And I found that if I use Michael Morpurgo books, because they're very emotional, because you really care about the characters, they're so believable, then they had the impact on the audience that I was looking for, and children would walk out of the door talking about the book and what they thought might happen and what they wanted to happen and what they dreaded might happen. And that was part of what pushed me to write something myself, to try to have that kind of impact on the reader. So Michael Morpurgo has played a big part in my career. If I go back to when I was younger, when I was a big reader as a teenager, I loved a lot of Victorian writers, in particular George Eliot. And if I had to pick one favourite writer, one inspiration, it would be her, because she has a fierce intellect and her style is just beautiful, but also very sharp, very witty. But at the same time, she has a big heart. So that means her sort of compassionate, authorly voice really communicates with you. And because she loves and knows her characters so deeply, as a reader, you love and know them really deeply. So she's my absolute heroine. When it comes to contemporary writers, I like Carol Shields. She's dead now. She was Canadian. But I think the same sort of spirit inhabits her work that inhabits George Eliot's.
Could you describe your working week?
My working week varies enormously because there are some times of the year when I'm really busy going into schools. Now, you can imagine World Book Day, it's the first Thursday in March. Everybody wants me on that day. So I end up being booked up every day of that week, usually most of the week before and most of the week that follows, and then I'm completely exhausted. It's just too much at my age. On the other hand, there are certain quiet times of the year where I'm basically mainly at home writing. So it does vary, but an ideal week for me would be, I would say, 3 days at home writing, with walks in the woods and the odd coffee date with a friend, and a couple of days in schools, maybe one secondary, one primary for variety. That would be a good week for me. I still enjoy it just as much. Every new book is just as exciting as the first, not only when I'm writing it, but also that moment, of course, when it has become a book and the book arrives on or around publication day and I get it out of the box with its shiny cover, I make myself a cup of tea, I sit on the sofa, put my knees up and I start, like a reader, to read my own book. And that's always a lovely moment, except that I find a mistake that I never spotted before. But yes, that's great, and I am prolific. Obviously, a lot of people are amazed that there have been, in 7 years, there have been 20 books. It is slightly ridiculous. But actually, it's even more ridiculous than that because I have about another 12 finished books on my memory sticks and laptop, waiting to be published. How am I so fast? I've no idea, except that as a child, I was like that. In school, I would write more than anybody else in less time. And when it came to those O-levels that you asked me about in the first place, I would be the one who was always putting my hand up asking for more paper. And people used to say, how many pages did you write? And I would say, 38 or so. So I'm a little bit like that on the laptop, even though I'm a two-finger typist. The thoughts flow very quickly, but I do edit very, very rigorously again and again and again, so I wouldn't like people to think I'm just a sort of back of the envelope writer. I'll finish that on to the next one. It's not like that at all, and I've become more and more self-critical, and it's almost impossible to satisfy myself now, because nothing I write is good enough, because I want each book to be better. So no book is ever perfect, of course. Even a classic book will have flaws. But that's what I'm aiming for. I'm aiming to improve all the time with practice. I think the biggest challenge being an author is the book world, because the book world is all about the bottom line. It's business, it's about celebrity, it's about the product, and books are actually referred to as products. And the jargon is always changing, they're always looking for a unique selling point. So in other words, you're supposed to pitch your idea in one sentence, and the idea of the one sentence is that could become a movie. Now, I don't write like that. If there are some of my books that really can't be reduced to one sentence, what's it about? Well, it's about people and relationships and life, and I don't necessarily have a sort of unique idea. So I feel a little bit out of sync or out of tune with the book world as it is, because I don't write genre. You can't pigeonhole me. And when I had an hour once up at HarperCollins, because they were considering signing me, they were thrown by my breadth. And the children's fiction editor actually said, well, we wouldn't know how to brand you. And I don't want to be branded. So it was just as well that we had a parting of the ways. But all of that I find frustrating. I find it frustrating that it isn't the quality of the writing that counts. It's whether they can sell it and how they can sell it.
Something happened to me a couple of weekends ago which was really interesting and unexpected. It's made me think a lot since. I was at a big alopecia event in London, and there as the new ambassador for Alopecia UK, and that's a role that has been very rewarding already, and I'm really, really enjoying it. And I talked to lots and lots of people with alopecia, and family members of people with alopecia, and everybody's story is completely different. And some people were walking around with a sticker that said not to be photographed, because they're wearing wigs and they don't want the people at work or whoever, people they know, to know that they have alopecia. And I used to be like that. And I talked to a doctor who has a little girl who's losing her hair, and she's 8 years old. He told me her story, but at the end of our conversation, he asked me something that really took my breath away. He said, has it ever occurred to you that your alopecia might be a gift? And I was quite taken aback, because for 28 years of my life, I saw it as a curse. A problem, something that made life more difficult. So to be asked by this doctor whether it was actually a gift puzzled me just for a moment, but only for a split second. And then I said, yes, it is. Because I've come through it, and because I've come through it, and it's no longer a problem for me, I can help people who are struggling with it. And that's what I've been doing as ambassador. That's what I've done with the book, because obviously lots of people who have read the alopecia book, The Waterhouse Girl, have read it because they've got alopecia, and it's supported them. It's made a difference to them. Maybe a small difference, but it's shown them that they're not alone, and there's someone who understands and has been through it. And the other side of it is that as ambassador, I go into schools where someone has alopecia, and then I can actually physically stand beside that person with alopecia and say, yes, I've got alopecia, and so has this person, and it's okay. And that can be a turning point in the life of that young person. And I could give you sort of a few examples of that. But that's quite thrilling, actually. So, yes, in a way, this curse has become a gift. And, of course, that's what happens in fiction. If you think about it, I would say probably the majority of novels are about a character who has some kind of problem. And that problem has to be overcome, and that's the story. So, life and stories, they get intertwined.